All right, Chapter 8, Letting Go of Himself. Andrew was relieved to say goodbye to St. Pancras. The Army had arranged for him to enter a rehabilitation program at a veterans hospital in Dorne, about 60 miles away. At the hospital, Andrew found it strangely comforting to be around other young men who had suffered similar experiences to his. No one stared at his cane, and if someone wanted to know how he had injured his leg, the person would ask Andrew directly and listen without grimacing through the explanation. The best thing of all about Dorne for Andrew was that it was situated not too far from Gorcum and Thila's home. On his first weekend of leave, Andrew made a beeline for Thila's house. But things did not start out well. The bus was so crowded that it had standing room only, and a woman stood up to allow Andrew to take her seat. Although he knew he could not stand the entire way, Andrew was humiliated to think that he looked so disabled. When Andrew finally got to Thila's house, things got worse. Although he had often imagined the wonderful moment of meeting Thila again, in reality, their meeting was tense. Thila wanted to know how Andrew was doing with his Bible reading, and Andrew had to admit that he had not picked the Bible up since arriving home. Thila looked very disappointed. "Andrew, God is waiting to turn your life around and shape you into something new. Why don't you let him?" she asked. It was the kind of question Mr. Wetstrom might have asked, but Andrew was in no mood to reflect on his spiritual condition. Although he wanted to retaliate to the question with some wisecrack, instead he became sullen. Everyone, it seemed, had some idea or plan for how to make him better. Yet, despite the unexpected turns in their conversation, Andrew enjoyed his visit with Thila and promised that he would return to see her again when he next got leave. It was several weeks, however, before Andrew got more leave, so he contented himself with writing to Thila. About a month after his visit with Thila, Andrew had an experience that he could not put into words. It all started when a pretty blonde young woman came into his ward at the Veterans Hospital. The woman invited Andrew and the other 20 men he shared the ward with to attend a revival meeting that evening. She announced that a bus had been arranged to transport those who wanted to go to the meeting site. The young men let out wolf whistles at her as she left the ward and promised that they would come to the meeting. Surprisingly, by 6:30 in the evening, all of the men from the ward were dressed in their best clothes and were waiting in line at the hospital door for the bus to arrive. Andrew and his friend Pierre, who shared the bed next to him in the ward, hung at the back of the line. Earlier in the afternoon, Pierre had sneaked into town and bought a bottle of gin, and now he and Andrew stood in line, taking large swigs from the bottle. By the time the bus arrived at 7 to pick the men up, Andrew was feeling the warm, comforting buzz of the alcohol enveloping him. Andrew and Pierre continued swigging the gin throughout the bus ride that took them to the outskirts of town, where a large tent had been erected for the meeting. Inside the tent, Andrew and Pierre found a seat at the back and drained the bottle of gin while they waited for the service to begin. The service began when a man with deep-set eyes and a narrow face took the podium. To Andrew, the man's face looked like that of a rat, and Andrew began to laugh out loud. Pierre joined in the laughter, and the two men were still guffawing when the opening hymn ended. Andrew had no idea how disruptive his and Pierre's behavior was until the rat-faced man announced, "Brothers and sisters, we have 2 men here tonight who are chained by the powers of a dark world." The man then began to pray out loud for Andrew and Pierre. As the man prayed, Andrew tried to control his laughter until his sides hurt. Finally, he lost the battle and was soon guffawing louder than ever, so loud, in fact, that he drowned out the rat-faced man's prayer. Andrew watched in drunken delight as the obviously frustrated man gave up his prayer and told the choir to sing. The choir stood to its feet and began singing the song, "Let My People Go." When the choir reached the chorus to the song, everyone in the tent joined in the singing. By now, Andrew and Pierre were laughing uncontrollably. In fact, Andrew could not recall a time when he had laughed so much. It felt good to laugh, even if the laughter was alcohol-induced. The choir sang on through the second verse of the song, but when the audience again joined in for the chorus, Andrew noticed a curious thing. As they belted out, "Let my people go," the words suddenly had a sobering effect on him. Andrew stopped laughing and listened to the words being sung around him. But instead of hearing "Let my people go," Andrew seemed to be hearing "Let me go," as though it were Andrew addressing some force outside of himself. Andrew sat silently on the bus ride back to the hospital, contemplating the words of the song. What could they mean, and why had they seemed to speak to him? The following morning, Andrew awoke with a hangover, but he also awoke with something else, a deep desire to read his mother's Bible. All that day he carried the Bible with him, reading it whenever he had a spare moment, and much to his surprise, he wanted to read more the following day and the day after that. Soon he had set himself a schedule to help guide him systematically through the whole Bible. As a result of his Bible reading, Andrew had a much more enjoyable visit with Thela the next time he went to see her. He now wanted to discuss with Thela what he was reading in the Bible, and he enjoyed Thela's comments and observations. He enjoyed his conversations with Thela so much, in fact, that he decided he would ask her to marry him as soon as he was released from the army and had a steady job. Andrew's release from the army and the rehabilitation center came in November 1949. The Dutch government gave Andrew a small severance allotment along with his discharge papers. Andrew used the money to buy a bicycle. The weeks of rehabilitation therapy had improved the strength in his right leg, but he still had a long way to go if he was to walk without a limp. Andrew decided that riding the bike around would both help to strengthen his leg and get him out onto the polders on which he had loved so much to run. Since Andrew had nowhere else to go after his release from the hospital and the army, he went back home to St. Pancras and moved in with his father. Although Andrew did not have a job, he did have a way to fill his days. He went to church, one service every night and 2 on Sundays. Some of the services were at the Reformed Church in St. Pancras, while others, such as the Salvation Army service in Alkmaar and the Baptist prayer meeting in Amsterdam, were a long bike ride away. Andrew did not care what denomination people belonged to as long as they believed the Bible and wanted to have fellowship with him. At the services he attended, Andrew took careful notes during the sermons and reviewed them the following day, rereading all the Bible passages mentioned and reflecting on their meaning and the meaning of the sermon to his life. The Vanderbiels were staunch members of the Dutch Reformed Church, and Andrew's church-attending actions did not please them. At first, Andrew was oblivious to their concerns, until one day when his sister Margie brought him a cup of tea. Andrew was sprawled out on his bed reading a psalm. Marcia said shyly, I know you have been through a lot, and I don't want to hurt your feelings, but I am worried about the amount of time you spend in your bedroom. It's not normal. And all this riding around to churches. You never used to go to service even once on Sunday, and now you go every day. Don't you think it's a bit much? Andrew stared at his sister. I just feel like I have to, Marcia. I wish I knew what was happening to me. Marcia sighed. Well, we are worried, and Papa especially. Her voice trailed off. Papa says it's shell shock. Andrew did not know what to say next, and Marcia put down the cup of tea and quietly left the room. As he thought back on his behavior since arriving home from the rehabilitation unit, Andrew had to admit that it probably did look strange to people. But am I in danger of becoming one of those religious kooks ranting on the streets in Amsterdam? Or even becoming like the Wetstras, quoting Bible verses for every situation? Is that what I'm turning into? These were sobering questions, and Andrew's tea grew cold as he pondered them. In the end, he could not come up with an answer. All he knew was that he left powerless to resist the fellowship of Christians wherever he could find it. He decided to discuss his family's concerns with Thela. Surely she would know what to do. But Thela proved to be anything but comforting. I have been wondering that too, Andy, Thela confided. I just didn't know how to bring up the subject. What do you mean? Andrew asked, thinking that if Thela thought like the members of his family, he must look more weird than he had ever imagined. Well, she continued awkwardly, I know you have to have something to hold on to now that you are back from the army, but do you have to be so fanatical about it? You don't want to burn yourself out. Why don't you read other books sometimes or go to the movies with me? Despite Thela's suggestion, Andrew found that he could not be bothered doing other things. He loved to read the Bible, pray, and go to church. Nothing else was remotely interesting to him. Then one night, soon after New Year 1950, Andrew had an experience that convinced him he was on track. It was a cold, blustery night. The wind howled around the Vanderbilt house, and sleet blew horizontally across the polder. Andrew lay in bed with the blankets pulled up tightly beneath his chin to keep him warm. As he stared at the darkened ceiling, the story that Sister Patrice had told him before he left Indonesia, and especially her words about how a monkey won't let go of something, flooded his memory. He also thought about the words of the song from the revival meeting in Dorne, "Let my people go." What am I holding on to? Andrew asked himself. Then the answer suddenly came to him. He had to let go of himself. He had to place his life fully and completely in God's hands. Quietly, in barely more than a whisper, Andrew opened his mouth and prayed, "Lord, if you will show me the way, I will follow you. Amen." This simple prayer led to instant changes in Andrew's life. For the first time in years, Andrew felt clean inside, as if his mind had been scrubbed out. He could not wait to tell someone about his experience, and the only people he was sure would understand what had happened to him were the Wetstras and Keyes. Andrew went and told Mr. and Mrs. Wetstra about his experience, and they were both delighted for him. Keyes also was delighted with the news, and he asked Andrew to become his prayer and Bible study partner. In the spring of 1950, just as the tulips were beginning to break through the soggy ground, Andrew and Keyes decided to go to Amsterdam together to hear a well-known Dutch evangelist named Arne Donker. Andrew was surprised at how much he enjoyed Pastor Donker's message, especially since he was feeling a little out of place among such an exuberant crowd. He began to feel truly uncomfortable, however, when Pastor Donker announced, "I have the feeling something unique is taking place here tonight. Someone in the audience is going to give himself as a missionary." Andrew sneaked a look at Keyes, and both men rolled their eyes at the same time. Andrew knew that they were both thinking the same thing. Let's get out of here before this turns weird. Without saying a word, they stood up and sidestepped their way to the end of the row. But so many people turned to look at them expectantly as they did so that they both sat down in the empty seats at the end of the row. "Better wait until this is over," Keyes whispered to Andrew. No one else in the auditorium had moved, but Arne Donker did not back down. "There is a life of constant danger and risk waiting to be claimed tonight by a young man, I think." Andrew looked straight ahead. Then, without thinking about what he was doing, he got back to his feet. Keyes also stood up, and like two lemmings returning to the sea, Andrew and Keyes marched single file toward the front of the auditorium. Andrew heard Pastor Donker say, "There you are, not one, but two of you. Wonderful, come all the way to the front." The aisle seemed to stretch on forever, but Andrew and Keyes did not stop until they had reached the front of the auditorium. "Kneel down, boys. I want to pray for you," Pastor Donker said. Andrew and Keyes knelt obediently, and Pastor Donker began to pray. Though Andrew did not take in any of what the pastor was praying, he did hear the instructions the pastor gave after finishing praying. "Make sure I talk to you before you leave tonight." The whole incident seemed surreal to Andrew as he sat in the front row while the congregation sang the closing hymn. When the meeting was over and everyone got up to leave, Andrew wanted to get up too and melt into the crowd. He felt compelled, however, to stay put and wait for the pastor to disentangle himself from the group of people who had gathered around him and were peppering him with questions. Finally, when the hall was nearly empty, Pastor Donker strode over to the front row pew. "So what are your names?" he asked. "Andrew and Keyes." Andrew quickly replied, hoping to avoid using last names or mentioning any other details such as where they came from. "Great. Andrew and Keyes. Fine names. Are you two ready for your first assignment?" Andrew felt sick in the pit of his stomach. He did not know why he had walked up to the front, but he was 100% sure that it had not been to sign on as Pastor Donker's puppet. "Where are you from?" the pastor asked. "St. Pancras," Andrew muttered. "Both of you?" Keyes nodded. Good. It is biblical to work in pairs. The New Testament model is for missionaries to begin in their own towns, their own backyards, and preach the gospel, and then move out from there. Andrew smiled weakly, afraid of what he was going to hear next. "So here's what you are going to do. Both of you are to prepare a short testimony, and I will come to St. Pancras next Saturday. At 1 o'clock, we will hold an open-air meeting outside the mayor's house. I will be there to support you and offer a few closing thoughts." Andrew felt the blood draining from his face. If his family thought he was turning into a religious fanatic before, what would they think when he started preaching in the streets? And not just any street, but the main street in St. Pancras. More than anything else, Andrew wanted to say no. No, he would not make a fool of himself. No, he would not prepare a testimony. No, he had not even intended to come down to the front. But try as he might, the word would not come out of his mouth. Instead, Andrew found himself nodding approvingly and giving Arndt Donker his address. Andrew and Keyes walked out of the auditorium in stunned silence. Andrew wished that Keyes had spoken up, and he was sure that Keyes wished the same thing of him. But neither of them had spoken up, and now they were stuck. There is one thing for sure, Andrew told himself as they made their way home. I am going to keep this as quiet as possible. I'm not going to invite a single person to attend the meeting, and if we're lucky, maybe no one will notice us.